George C. Williams said that biology is physics plus natural selection. We could informally say biology is physics plus the illusion of purpose. Some see purpose or design at the very root and beginning of the universe. Others, of whom I am one, see purpose as something that blossoms late in the history of the universe. In honor of William Paley, I want to call myself a neo-Paleyist. I'm obsessed with the illusion of purpose, adaptation. Paley himself, of course, was a paleo-Paleyist. This is a diagram from Paley of his famous dissected watch, the springs from a watch, and he made the point, as you know, that an organ such as an eye must perforce have a watchmaker, a divine watchmaker. Neo-Paleyists, like us today, see purpose as a high-tech, emergent, the fruit of an advanced production line. Purpose is uniquely manifested by the production line that we call Darwinian evolution, by life and by the artifacts and tools of life. Neo-Paleyists will also make a further distinction between two kinds of purpose. Purpose one is the illusion of purpose that characterizes all living things, like the cheetah of my first slide. And purpose two is premeditated purpose, as shown by human brains and perhaps the brains of some other animals. Purpose two we could call watchmaker purpose. Purpose one is blind watchmaker purpose. And, as I've said, Paley's watchmaker was a divine watchmaker. The philosophic divide between, let's say, paleoteleology and neoteleology is sometimes portrayed as a matter for individual choice, almost a matter of taste, set off to one side from scientifically decidable questions. You'll meet this when you hear people saying that as for the origin of the universe and whether the laws of physics had some purpose, that is not a scientifically decidable question, but a purely religious question. Some may even resent my mentioning the matter at a scientific meeting, and I find this bland view baffling. Nature, it seems, is the popular name for milliards and milliards and milliards of particles playing their infinite game of billiards and billiards and billiards. Scientifically speaking, what could be more different than, on the one hand, a universe with purpose built into its very beginning, and on the other hand, a universe of aimless atomic billiards from which purpose slowly struggles into existence. This divide, it seems to me, is at least as deep, purely scientifically speaking, as any divide, such as, for instance, between the Big Bang theory and the steady-state theory. Neoteleology and paleoteleology are two rival cosmologies, two rival biologies. David Hume perceived a fatal flaw in paleoteleology, but he wasn't able to offer an alternative. That was left to Darwin and the Darwinians. I have made the case, and I believe it, that evolution by natural selection is the only process that's ever been suggested which is in principle capable of explaining adaptive complexity. I don't mean to say that it's the only process that governs evolution, but it is the only process that governs adaptive evolution. Now, it's right and proper that we should express Darwin's theory in something like his own terms. That's an example of an adaptive, that's a bee orchid. This is Richard Lewontin's well-known formulation of the fundamental principles of Darwinism, and I'll leave you to read them. I hope you can read them. If we look at these principles, and even if we add a fourth, overpopulation, which Darwin himself laid stress on, we find that they all follow, I believe, from one fundamental principle, the principle of heredity. And I think it's the same as what Professor Eigen means by information. If we ask the question, what is the minimum condition that must arise on a planet, anywhere in the universe, in order for the arising of life and the phenomenon of apparent purpose to flip from very improbable to very probable, what's that key event? And the answer, it seems to me, is the spontaneous arising of the phenomenon of heredity, true heredity, as opposed to mere reproduction. This analogy of prairie fires illustrates what I mean by reproduction without heredity. Each of those prairie fires is spawned by a spark which comes from a mother fire. We have daughter fires and we have mother fires. We have a clear lineage of ancestry and descendants, but we have no heredity because to the extent that the individual fires differ from one another, they gather their properties from their environment and not from the spark that set them. In true heredity, they would gather at least part of their variation of their properties from the spark that they gained from their parent. Any object that is made by growing on its predecessors as a template, that object is subject to true heredity. And then all the other principles of Darwinism follow semi-automatically. The population of hereditary particles tends to increase exponentially. There's then competition for the raw materials that they need to build more replicas. Mutation is inevitable because no replication process is perfect. Some variants are then bound to be more successful than others in the business of self-replication, and the world becomes filled with hereditary information which is good at filling the world, good at self-replication. Exactly what being good at self-replication turns out to mean varies a good deal in detail. In our experience on this planet, it turns out to mean manipulating a collection of local levers of power which together add up to what we call a phenotype. In late developing extreme cases, we are a late developing extreme case, the bundle of phenotypic entities happens to add up to a coherent, compact machine which we call an individual body. And we've arrived back at the Darwinian formulation that I put up on a slide. Either the formulation phrased in terms of the individual maximizing its fitness, or in terms of the replicator, the gene, maximizing its survival, is equivalent to the other, and it's at least partly a matter of taste and convenience which we use. I don't think there's any great disagreement between the view that the unit of selection is the gene and the unit of selection is the individual. I regard them as merely semantically different ways of putting the same thing. What's happened in recent years is that more and more field biologists and textbook authors have subtly shifted the focus of their language from the individual to the gene. I'm going to run quickly through, don't raise the lights for this series, run quickly through a series of books, and you can simply read the quotations that I call your attention to. So Maynard Smith says the most exciting thing to have emerged is what may be termed a gene-centered view of evolution. Life on Earth is all about the replication of copying of strands of DNA. The complexity of life we see around us is a result of competition and selection, which produced a variety of different ways of ensuring the copying of DNA. Freeman Dyson, every species is the prisoner of its genes and is compelled to develop and to behave in such a way as to maximize their chances of survival. That's a standard modern textbook of animal behavior, says a similar thing. Standard textbook of biology. An adaptation then is a characteristic that enhances an organism's chances of perpetuating its genes. This is not exactly a random sample of books, but it is a 100% sample of books by M. Ridley. That's Matt Ridley and Mark Ridley saying a similar thing. A high percentage of present company. This is Sagan and Dryan. It's not hard to imagine that what's really going on is an evolution of genetic instructions, battles between the genetic instructions of competing organisms, genetic instructions calling the shots, with the plants and animals little more or maybe nothing more than automata. The genes arrange for their own continuance. Stephen Gould, ever since Darwin, they struggle continuously to increase the representation of their genes at the expense of their fellows. And that, for all its boldness, is all there is to it. We have discovered no higher principle in nature. A modern textbook of behavioral ecology. The individual can be regarded as a temporary vehicle or survival machine by which genes survive and are replicated. If you look up the word gene in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, this is the only quotation you will find on genes, I'm sorry to say. They are in you and in me. They created us, body and mind, and their preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence. Now they go by the name of genes, and we are their survival machines. The gene's eye view of creation has become so familiar to commentators that it has, very unfairly, been tagged on to at least one book whose stance is in fact the exact opposite. This is Brian Goodwin's book, just recently out. You can see what kind of book this is by the publisher's blurb at the top. This book transforms the competitive individualism and intellectual imperialism of the quantitative sciences of modernity into a postmodern science of qualities. More lucidly than his blurb writer, Brian Goodwin himself has the following to say under the heading, "Whatever happened to organisms?" Something very curious and interesting has happened to biology in recent years. Organisms have disappeared as the fundamental unit of life. In their place, we now have genes. This genocentric biology is a perfectly logical consequence of the way Darwin chose to describe evolution. But, and from the point of view of this talk, the rest of Goodwin's book may be described as one long but. And I have a great interest in it. I don't want to knock that. But the point I'm making is that very unfairly, the review of this book in The Independent comes under the heading, "A Gene's Eye View of the Whole of Creation," which would hardly be a more accurate description of the opposite of Goodwin's view. And the caption of the rifle bird on the left is "All in the Genes." Now, if I had more time, I should like to discuss Brian Goodwin's interesting arguments against the gene's eye view of creation, and in the course of it, I would come out as much more sympathetic to his view and to Stephen Gould's view, as we've just heard, about the role of embryology. I would take a more creative and a more progressionist view than Stephen Gould. I coined the phrase kaleidoscopic embryology. This slide is intended to illustrate the beautiful products of an embryology analogously to the processes of crystallization. It occurs to me that kaleidoscopic embryologies one may describe as embryologies that are good at evolving, and that there might be a kind of higher order selection for improved embryologies that are not specifically good at individual survival, but are good at evolution. And that is a very heretical statement for somebody like me to make, and it is my olive branch to, though he may not see it that way, to Stephen Gould and, although I think he's not here, to Brian Goodwin. Now, I don't have time to go into that, and I want to do a little rush through the history of what I'm calling the gene's eye view of creation. Darwin himself, as we've heard, saw the living world as a struggle between individual organisms, particularly between individuals of the same species. Darwin was aware that what individuals are struggling for is not survival per se, but reproduction. Survival is merely a means to reproduction, and in those cases where reproduction can be separated from survival, where adaptations to reproduction have nothing to do with survival, Darwin had no problems with that, quite the contrary, and one feels that in the light of that he would have been very sympathetic to what I'm calling the gene's eye view of creation. He would have been even more enthusiastic at the digital particulateness of the Mendelian gene. The irony has often been noted that, almost to a point of cliche, that if Darwin had only read Mendel, he would have had a ready answer to Fleming Jenkins' discomforting argument. Blending inheritance, as everybody believed in those days, a kind of analog inheritance, a kind of liquid inheritance, the child as a more or less liquid fusion of its parents, does not lend itself to natural selection, as Jenkins pointed out, because, well, as Fisher later expressed it, the heritable variance is approximately halved in every generation. mix black paint and white, you'll get grey, and no amount of remixing grey with grey will ever reconstitute the original black and white. Hardy and Weinberg first realized that this would not apply under Mendelian particulate inheritance, but it was left to Fisher and the other founding fathers of population genetics to put together a proper digital theory of natural selection around 1930. Neo-Darwinism is fundamentally a digital theory. Genes are discrete things that you can count. Evolutionary change consists of changes in gene frequencies in populations, albeit we may actually study the phenotypic consequences rather than the genes themselves. The other essential ingredient in the genes I view is Weismannism. I refer you to the middle of these three pictures. Weismann, this is in modern terms, Weismann talked about the germplasm, we should say DNA. DNA gives rise to DNA, gives rise to DNA, down successive generations, and the phenotype, the body, is an offshoot in every generation. There are causal arrows going that way from genotype to phenotype. There are no causal arrows going backwards. John Maynard Smith, one of our most respected evolutionary theorists, has concluded that after Darwin, Weismann was the greatest evolutionary biologist of the 19th century, and for what it's worth, some people may not think that's much, I'd rate Weismann as the father of the selfish gene concept. That's an illustration of the idea of a digital river. Today in the post-Watson-Crick era, we see Weismann's river as a digital river. The Watson-Crick gene is a triumphantly digital, reductionistic entity with a remorselessly mechanistic feel to it. Every week, the pages of Nature are filled with confident details about the exact sequences of digits in particular named genes in named organisms. This would have been inconceivable to, for example, the historian of science Charles Singer, who in 1931 had this to say about the gene. Further, despite interpretations to the contrary, the theory of the gene is not a mechanist theory. The gene is no more comprehensible as a chemical or physical entity than is the cell, or for that matter, the organism itself. Atoms exist independently, and their properties as such can be examined. They can even be isolated. Not so the gene. The doctrine of the relativity of functions is as true for the gene as it is for any of the organs of the body. They exist and function only in relation to other organs. Thus, the last of the biological theories leaves us where the first started, in the presence of a power called life or psyche. The point about that quote from the Meadowers is the bit that comes towards the end about the some resent the whole idea of elucidating any entity or state of affairs that would otherwise have continued to languish in a familiar and non-threatening squalor of incomprehension. Now, there is a confusion here that I must clear up, because Singer's remarks sound superficially like something else which we might say, which is in fact quite sensible. For example, the much-used cake analogy for the inextricable blending of genetic effects in development. Here's one version of the cake analogy written in 1981, to which I would still subscribe wholeheartedly. If we follow a particular recipe word for word in a cookery book, what finally emerges from the oven is a cake. We cannot now break the cake into its component crumbs and say, this crumb corresponds to the first word in the recipe, this crumb corresponds to the second word in the recipe, and so on. With minor exceptions such as the cherry on top, there is no one-to-one mapping from words of recipe to bits of cake. The whole recipe maps onto the whole cake. Now, that is not contradictory to my earlier reductionistic stance about genes. The trick is to realize that genetics is not the same thing as embryology. Here's another picture of a Weismann diagram. That's Erasmus Darwin, Robert Darwin, and Charles Darwin. Those are the phenotypes, and those are the genes going down the germline again. What I want to say now is that genes do two very distinct things, as Weismann realized in his earlier language. When they pass down the generations, then we're talking about genetics. But when we talk about their influence on phenotypes, we're talking about embryology. Embryology is a blending phenomenon. Genetics is a particulate phenomenon. When wearing their embryological hat, genes seem to interact in inextricable complexity. The effects of genes really do seem to blend. But the genes themselves do not blend. When wearing their genetic hat, genes are digital, independent, a reductionist dream. The gene's eye view of creation was essentially in place after the synthesis of the 1930s, but as so often, its full implications were not generally grasped until later. And I think, well, in the 1960s, really, 60s and 70s, and pivotal figures were W.D. Hamilton, who's here quoted as saying, despite the principle of survival of the fittest, the ultimate criterion that determines whether G will spread, that's a gene, is not whether the behavior is to the benefit of the behavior of the behavior, but whether it is to the benefit of the gene G. Hamilton coined the phrase inclusive fitness, which I would characterize with his blessing as that quantity which an individual organism will appear to be maximizing when what is really being maximized is gene survival. The other pivotal figure I mentioned is George Williams, who's on the right of that trio. On the left, incidentally, is Niles Eldridge. Williams said in his book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, well, there he very clearly saw the significance for natural selection of, well, firstly, of Weismann's immortal river, and combining it especially with the Mendelian recombination of digital particles. Williams said, with Socrates' death, not only did his phenotype disappear, but also his genotype. Socrates' genes may be with us yet, but not his genotype, because meiosis and recombination destroy genotypes as surely as death. And he goes on, it is only the meiotically dissociated fragments of the genotype that are transmitted in sexual reproduction, and these fragments are further fragmented by meiosis in the next generation. If there is an ultimate indivisible fragment, it is by definition the gene that is treated in the abstract discussions of population geneticists. I carried this thought through to its logical conclusion when I wrote that, to be strict, this book should be called not the selfish cistron nor the selfish chromosome, but the slightly selfish big bit of chromosome and the even more selfish little bit of chromosome. To say the least, this is not a catchy title, so defining a gene as a little bit of chromosome which potentially lasts for many generations, I call the book The Selfish Gene. Now, I don't think that either Williams or Hamilton thought that they were saying anything that was controversial, anything that was not implicit in the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the 1930s, and nor did I. I just carried the point to its logical conclusion and put it in more radical language which appealed to some people and affronted others. This is again from the New Yorker. The caption is, the way I see it, we're being exploited by our genes, and by George, I intend to do something about it. Part of this affront was due to the misunderstanding of genetic determinism and the idea, which no doubt some of my metaphorical language had triggered in people's minds, that genes were little gremlins, cynically and with deliberate, malevolent intent, manipulating us. And it has to be said that my publishers, some of them without my knowledge and without realizing what they were doing, seemed to do their best to abet this unfortunate misunderstanding. Again, there you see the puppet strings dangling from the word gene. Once again, I think we have a confusion between genetics and development. Here the idea is that people jumped to the conclusion that the selfish gene must be talking about irrevocable deterministic manipulation of development, when what in fact it was about was the independent immortality of genes passing down through geological time. what's now clear, that's a snake in the Garden of Eden with, if you look carefully at the markings, you'll see what lies inside it. That snake is a survival machine for its DNA. What's now clear is that Hamilton and Williams's gene's eye view of creation, although it still arouses deep suspicions in the social sciences, has now more or less completely taken over field studies of animal behavior and behavioral ecology, as I emphasized with my series of slides of current books. And to confirm it, you need only look at a current copy of, say, American Naturalist or Behavioral Ecology or Animal Behavior or relevant papers in Nature. It's, of course, central to our understanding of the social insects. This is a picture of honeypot ants, which are workers that are completely devoted to being food stores for other ants. And as you know, they're working for, although they're sterile, they're working for copies of their genes in other individuals, in reproductive individuals. Here's an old puzzle in biology, the problem of cuckoo eggs. You see that some so-called gentes, races of cuckoos, lay eggs in different species of host, and their eggs mimic the pattern of the host eggs. This is a bit of a puzzle, because whereas females who actually lay the eggs nearly always lay in the same nest as they themselves were brought up in, so you have robin cuckoos and meadow pipit cuckoos and reed warbler cuckoos, males aren't fussy who they mate with females regardless of whether they were brought up in the same kind of foster nest as they, the males themselves, were. So the only way we can understand how it is that the different female races lay different colored eggs, even though they must be continually contaminated by gene flow brought about by males from other gentes, from other races, we have to take a gene's eye view. We have to say that, we have to notice that in birds, the XY chromosome system is different. The XY sex is the female sex. And the easiest way to explain this is to assume that the genes that determine the egg spotting pattern are on the Y chromosome, which only females have. And if you think about what that means, since every female lays an egg in the same kind of nest as she herself was laid in, that's to say her mother laid in, then of all the genes in her, only the genes on the Y chromosome can look back at their history and say to themselves, we have always been in reed warbler nests, or we have always been in robin nests. All the other genes in the female's genome have been in a variety, have run the gamut of all the different kinds of foster nest. By taking a gene's eye view, by seeing from the point of view of the geological history, the history through geological time of particular, no, geological is too long, historical time, of particular parts of the genome, we see that all of the genome is distributed in history throughout the different races, throughout the different kinds of foster nest. Only the Y chromosome genes have exclusively been in one kind of nest. Now, some people make a distinction between selfish genes and ultra-selfish genes. So-called selfish DNA might be described as ultra-selfish. The selfish DNA hypothesis concerns the large surplus of DNA, which appears to do nothing, has no effect on phenotypes. And this seems worrying if you're fixated on the idea of natural selection acting on the whole organism. As soon as you switch focus and see natural selection as working on genes and see organisms as vehicles constructed for the propagation of genes, you're no longer surprised that they might harbor parasitic genes, just freeloaders. The ultimate parasite, as Crick called it. Meiotic drive genes are more obviously antisocial. They take direct active steps to further their own interests at the expense of the organisms. A meiotic drive gene influences the meiotic process. Its phenotypic effect is to influence the meiotic process so that it, the gene, has more than a 50% chance of getting into any one gamete, and so it necessarily tends to spread unless it's stopped by some means. What some authors would call selfish here, others would prefer to call ultra-selfish or outlaw genes, and this is because, according to the theory of the selfish gene. All genes are, in a sense, selfish. It's just that some of them, like meiotic drive genes or selfish DNA, are nakedly, anarchistically selfish, promoting their own advantage at the expense of the other genes in the organism, whereas others you could think of as socialized genes, or perhaps we should prefer to say that they are driven by an analogue of Adam Smith's hidden hand. On this view, natural selection is still favoring genes that take whatever selfish steps are necessary to survive, but this means to survive in the ambient environment. And for most genes, the most salient part of the ambient environment is other genes. Natural selection favors those genes that flourish in the presence of the other genes with whom they share a succession of individual bodies. And in sexual species, that means other genes in the gene pool. A flourishes in the presence of B, and B flourishes in the presence of A. And this hidden hand way of looking at it is quite different from the alternative formulation. The group AB flourishes as a unit. But even so, we would want to know, why don't all genes become outlaws like meiotic drive genes? Why do we have organisms at all? And the answer that I have given in the extended phenotype, and don't have time to go into now, is that genes cooperate to the extent that they expect to leave the present generation and enter the next generation via a common bottlenecked gamete. It's because all the genes in a dog have the same expectation of leaving this dog and getting into the next dog via the same bottleneck, namely the sperms or eggs of this dog, that they all agree about what is the optimum phenotype for a dog. If there were a parasite which was transmitted into the next generation in the gametes of the dog, then the parasite genes and the dog genes would agree about what is the optimum dog phenotype, and they would both influence the dog phenotype in the same direction, even down to, well, for example, in a peacock, they would even agree that the peacock must have a beautiful tail so as to attract females, because the parasite genes and the peacock's genes all need to all need the peacock to reproduce successfully, and that means attracting a mate. What this slide is showing is two kinds of parasite. That kind of parasite is transmitted through the gametes of the dog. This kind of parasite is transmitted through the saliva of the dog. And because it's not transmitted through the gametes, it does not have the same adaptive interests at heart, and therefore it has no interest in the dog's survival, and the dog becomes very ill. The dog up the top is supposed to look ultra healthy because its parasite genes are assisting in the same task as the other ones. So there is nothing inherently group-minded, if I can use this metaphorical language for brevity, about the genes in us. We could be regarded as a gigantic colony of viruses. It's just that most of those viruses stand to gain from the same outcomes because their route into future generations is via our gametes. If a minority of them discover an alternative route, like tickling the nose to get us to sneeze them out and be breathed in by somebody else, then they would do that, and we wouldn't then call them our genes, we would call them viruses. So parasitic genes and our own genes are fundamentally playing the same game, and we can see ourselves as a colony of viruses. Now, I want to end with a more cosmic gene's eye view. This is a couple of pictures from Carl Sagan's magnificent book Cosmos, and I want to introduce an analogy with supernovas. A supernova, as I understand it, is a very rare kind of explosion which can happen. I think only 3 have been recorded in our galaxy since in recorded history. So going supernova is something that very, very occasionally happens to a star. Something goes critical and it explodes with shattering violence. Now there's another kind of explosion that can happen to a star, or more correctly to a planet in its immediate vicinity. It can go information. We can call this kind of explosion an information bomb or a replication bomb. The replication bomb begins more slowly than a supernova, and it takes much longer to build up. We don't know much about them in general because we, as somebody's remarked already today, we only have one example, our own phenomenon of evolution on Earth. And our replication bomb is still in progress. It's been underway for 4 billion years, as we've heard, and it is just now reaching the threshold of spilling away, leaking away from the immediate vicinity of the star. If our one example is any guide, we can guess that a replication bomb typically passes through a number of stages, which I've listed here and will briefly talk through. Firstly, there's the origin of heredity, the origin of life that Professor Eigen was talking about this morning. Secondly, the phenotype threshold. This is, you could call, the Weismann threshold. This is the separation between genotype and phenotype. The genes survive by manipulating other matter other than themselves. Thirdly, the replicator team threshold. That's the point I was making earlier about genes surviving in each other's presence and therefore, in effect, cooperating. And I equate this in our life form with the origin of cells. Fourthly, the many cells threshold. This is where you have very large, enormously large phenotypes by comparison with the genes that built them, achieved by exponentially multiplying cells in patterns of complex embryology. Fifthly, the high-speed information threshold, where you have nervous systems and brains and the invention of a whole new kind of information, which is, as Professor Eigen was saying, analogous to genetic information, but it works on a different timescale and through a different medium. Do we have the videotape, Bryson? Thank you. I'm sorry about this videotape. It was done by pointing a camera at a computer screen, which you know is a bad thing to do. This shows the swelling of the mammalian, the primate skull, really. We're starting with a mammal-like reptile. You see them on these two screens here. And now you're seeing a computer animation of the evolution of the skull. You watch it slowly changing. We're now coming into some early primates. Now we're coming into some early apes. And now we're coming towards Australopithecus, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and notice how the brain case is blowing up like a balloon. This is now then rapidly going backwards through this evolutionary series. This is an extrapolation done by a computer program called Morph. I must give credit to the Morph company for the Apple Macintosh. That's just an illustration of another kind of explosion, the nervous system explosion. The sixth threshold, and I apologize for using the phrase cultural evolution, there it is, I had no time to change it after Steve's lecture. Language, technology, and exosomatic memory, books, and nowadays computers. Seventhly, the radio threshold, and this is significant for the metaphor of the information bomb, because it's by radio that the impact of the information bomb first begins to stream out from the home planet, from the home star's vicinity. Oh, sorry. Does this go backwards? Right. Exosomatic information processing, I put that in because I do think computers are important in our story for many reasons, not least because there's at least a possibility that if they become capable of evolving themselves, they might eventually usurp the life that spawned them. Finally, the space travel threshold, where the life form itself actually leaves the parent star. This is another illustration from Carl Sagan, where he's looking far, far into the future and imagining these are stars here, and he's imagining two kinds of life form spreading at different rates. The One type is spreading in rather large hops between stars. Another type down here is spreading in small hops, and one could think of this as a kind of cosmic ecological competition. And finally, this slide, it's a T4 bacteriophage in outer space, playing the part of a lunar lander, symbolizing the outward spread of a DNA-based explosion. The story of the replication bomb begins with the spontaneous arising of self-replicating information, with a gene in the broad sense. It continues through a long time, on our planet 4,000 million years so far, of duplication of genetic information. Relatively late, it gives rise to the birth of a new kind of information, nervous system information, and on our planet that has coincided with a new kind of, with all sorts of things, but among others, with a new kind of purpose, deliberate, intentional purpose, with technology, with culture, with language. And under the right conditions, it, as seen on our planet, nervous system information may initiate a new speeding up of the explosion, the information explosion, which may either end in destruction or in outward reverberations which have no obvious boundary. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen.